on the 27th of October 1962, the actions of one man saved the world. His name, Vasily Arkhipov, a Russian officer serving on a Soviet submarine B-59. How could one man make such an impact? Not many people know this story, so please allow me to share it with you. When the Second World War ended with the death of Hitler and the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, all of humanity hoped it would be the last war. In spite of that, the world was plunged in a new sort, one without direct conflict. Once allied to defeat Nazi Germany, the two mightiest nations on the planet, the Soviet Union and the United States of America, now fought each other to be the undisputed superpower of the world in an arms race known as the Cold War. Something changed since the bombing of Japan. With the invention of nuclear power used to build bombs Fat Man and Little Boy, humanity now had the power to annihilate all life on Earth. First only the United States, but later also the Soviet Union. Both knew that if one of them used any nuclear weapon, bomb or missile, they would force the other side to retaliate with equal power, leaving no one left alive to call themselves the winner. Trying to avoid direct confrontation, both nations did everything in their power to get ahead of each other at any given opportunity.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
They created better weapons, faster rockets, and more advanced technology. Everything to be better than the enemy. But when the United States built missile launch sites in both Turkey and Italy capable of reaching Moscow, the Soviet Union felt that the US had crossed the line. The Soviets now felt threatened in their homeland. During the Cold War, both nations heavily influenced their neighboring countries for their own safety. After all, if you control your neighbors, your enemy can't. Later, these countries would be known as satellite states. A country that is formally independent but under heavy political, economic and military influence or control from another nation. In Europe, the Soviets indirectly controlled countries bordering Russian territory and East Germany. In the Americas, the situation looked quite similar. That left the Soviets with only one option: an island in the Northern Caribbean very close to the United States. Located just 90 miles from the mainland, Cuba allowed the Soviet Union to station nuclear missiles within striking distance of the major cities. No other countries in the Americas was aligned with the Soviets to the degree Cuba was. Only 10 years prior to the Cuban Missile Crisis, Cuba was ruled by an American-backed dictator by the name of Batista. Under his leadership, Cuba became a playground for the world's elite. High-end hotels and casinos were built, and many of them were financed or even managed by American investors and organized crime syndicates. Corruption spread through Cuba like a cancer, and many of the Cuban people despised Batista for it, especially a young lawyer by the name of Fidel Castro.
I want to tell you, the government, the president of Cuba now is consolidated in the power and have the help of the biggest movement and of the public opinion.
At first, he tried fighting the wrongful dictatorship in a courtroom, but with no results. In 1953, Castro decided words alone were no longer enough. Together with a group of like-minded men, he launched an attack on the Moncada barracks. It was a total disaster. Castro was captured, tried and sentenced to prison, during which he gave his famous speech, "History will absolve me." Released in 1955 as part of a general amnesty, Fidel and his brother left Cuba, only to return a year later to once more try to remove Cuba of its corrupt cancer. By 1959, his army of rebels had grown into a formidable force, and Batista, eventually losing the support of both the Cuban people and his US investors, fled the country.
Cuba goes on a patriotic binge after the government seizes a score of U.S. companies, a move denounced by Catholic authorities influential in this Catholic country. The name is chiseled from the telephone building and signs torn down from this and other properties worth nearly $1 billion.
Fidel Castro entered Havana to a hero's welcome, but his vision for Cuba turned out to be a nightmare to the United States. Castro declared his government socialist. After the Cuban Revolution in 1959, Castro initially avoided declaring a formal alliance with the Soviet Union. The United States wanted Fidel Castro to fail. Communism had to fail. They even went as far as to stage an invasion of Cuba, using Cuban exiles that fled during Castro's revolution. Today it is known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, which ultimately failed. The American-backed exiles were either killed or imprisoned, and the invasion left Cuba no other option than to formally ally with the Soviet Union.
Russians turned out in thousands to show the world, and America in particular, that Nicky loves Fidel. Tries to play off two big men against each other. It doesn't always come off. Still, it's good while it lasts. Let's hope someone hasn't stopped using, what's the name of that stuff?
The United States now had a communist island in its own backyard, and the Soviet Union saw Cuba as their one chance to level the playing ground. If they could install a missile installation on Cuba, they would counterbalance the American missile sites placed in Turkey and Italy. The US first obtained photographic evidence on the 14th of October, when a U-2 plane took 928 pictures capturing images of what turned out to be a nuclear missile site in western Cuba. This made the threat of nuclear destruction by two world superpowers a reality. The president of the time, John F. Kennedy, made a decision.
Here is President Kennedy as he delivered that message bearing on recent events in Cuba.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
The United States ordered a blockade of Cuba.
I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. First, to halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
No vessel was to deliver any military-related goods to the island, a decision the Soviets could not respect. The Soviet cargo ships would be ordered to ignore the American blockade. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, 4 Soviet submarines from the Foxtrot class were deployed to the region near the US naval blockade of Cuba. Their mission was to hide from the Americans and secretly patrol the waters near Cuba. If a war broke out between the United States and the Soviet Union, these submarines were all armed with a nuclear torpedo to make the first strike. An important detail is that the submarine had limited ability to communicate with Moscow while being submerged, leading to isolation and uncertainty what was happening above the water. Eventually, the US Navy became aware of the submarines and actively sought to track and surface them. When Americans found the submarine B-59, they tried contacting them, but to no avail. Either the Russians didn't receive the radio broadcasts, or they were just ignoring them. Not wanting to start a war, the United States Navy decided to drop signaling depth charges. They contain very little charge and are not intended to cause damage. At that point, submarine B-59 had not been in contact with Moscow for several days. The submarine only had been picking up US radio broadcasts, but once they began to hide from the pursuers, the submarine had to run too deep to monitor any radio traffic, and those on board did not know whether the war had started. Conditions inside the vessel were becoming unbearable. The submarine was overcrowded, short on drinking water and breathable air, and extremely hot. The crew was suffering from lack of ventilation, high levels of CO2, diesel fumes, and some of the sailors were collapsing from heat stroke. Above the water, 14 United States vessels surrounded the submarine and were dropping grenades and depth charges. The submarine was under attack, at least it seemed that way to the crew. When B-59 was finally hit with something stronger than depth charges, the captain, Valentine Savitsky, was convinced. He thought the war had started. The captain ordered the crew to prepare the nuclear torpedo. Before firing, the Soviet protocol for using the nuclear torpedo required the agreement of 3 senior officers aboard the submarine: Captain Savitsky, the political officer Ivan Maslenikov, and the second in command Vasily Arkhipov. The captain voted to launch the nuclear missile. The political officer agreed. Only one vote remained, but Arkhipov refused. He knew what it would mean to use a nuclear weapon. He understood that launching the torpedo would almost certainly lead to nuclear war. Millions of innocent people would die. Arkhipov knew that if they were wrong and they launched the torpedo, there was no turning back. They might not just doom themselves, but their families as well. Arkhipov refused, and the Soviet submarine was left with no other option than to surface. Above the water, the United States Navy was waiting to escort them back to the blockade, where they contacted Russia and received a message to return home. The entire world was on the brink of nuclear disaster, and we were all saved by this man. Eventually, the blockade ended with a mutual agreement. The United States promised not to invade Cuba and will remove their missile sites in Turkey. And in turn, the Soviet Union will abandon the missile sites on Cuba. Once returned home, the crew of B-59 were not received as heroes, criticized for surfacing and failing to complete their mission. The Soviet military leadership saw the decision to surface as a failure to maintain secrecy. Arkhipov died in 1989, and it wasn't until decades later that he finally received some recognition. For his heroic act, he received the first Future of Life Award for his actions that saved mankind.